here's to in situ. There are water quality and quantity concerns and landscape effects that really need to be better understood. The impact on water of in situ is really insufficiently understood. We know that in situ will cover a larger area in Alberta in future years than surface mining will, and they use both non-saline and saline groundwater. There was a recent paper by some groundwater geologists, and they pointed to several concerns. First of all, the large volumes of water that will be needed, the disposal of wastewater by injection, the protection of both energy resources and groundwater with all the in situ wells and the disposal and the perforations of the bedrock and the aquatards and the aquifers, and we'll get into it. And finally, the avoidance of large-scale flows of water or energy resources across geologic formations. Okay, so water quality. One of the issues of concerns is already in the basal McMurray aquifer, the disposal of SAGD wastewater. They produce a lot of wastewater. What can they do with it? Well, some group of people decided that here's a very efficient way to get rid of this stuff. Let's just put this SAGD wastewater into the basal McMurray aquifer. Now, unfortunately, that aquifer outcrops along the Christina and the Athabasca River. The other problem is that above the basal aquifer, there's what's known as an aquitard. That's a zone that prevents water from flowing. It retards flow. Now, it's basically protecting things above it from the nasty chemistry of the basal McMurray aquifer. And the bitumen is a large part of that protection. So once the bitumen is removed, the aquitard is lost, and so the wastewater that's being put down into the basal McMurray aquifer can not only seep out along the Christina and the Athabasca rivers, it can also migrate throughout the ground. So that's a big concern in the present and the future. The US EPA has studied groundwater contamination from in situ much more than has been studied in Canada, and they have concluded that most, if not all, in situ recovery operations appear to have caused some groundwater contamination. The most common source of that contamination is migration of combustion products such as benzene and phenols from reaction zones. By reaction zone, I mean the area underground where they create what is known as a fire flood. So they'll actually pump oxygen underground and start a fire underground, which will heat up the bitumen and allows it to flow. Well, the products of all of this combustion are unpleasant, and that's probably where they think most of the contamination is coming from for that type of recovery process. Now, a scientist from the University of Michigan looked at groundwater contamination with respect to arsenic in the Cold Lake region, and he observed that about 12% of the wells had very high levels of arsenic. This is the Canadian maximum acceptable concentration, 25 micrograms per liter. However, the long-term acceptable elevated cancer risk for arsenic in the drinking water is set at 0.2 micrograms. In other words, if you have more than this amount of arsenic in your drinking water, there is you're over what's known as the acceptable elevated cancer risk due to arsenic. So 12% of the wells have basically 100 times that in the Cold Lake region. They observed high arsenic levels around the well casings of petroleum wells. They also noted high amounts of chloride, and they thought that was from oil extraction fluids. They the first researcher who looked at this thought that it was probably due to increases in temperature, which changes the groundwater chemistry in terms of the reduction and oxidation potential of arsenic in the ground. And if you go back and compare in 1978, 25% of the wells in the area had more than 5 micrograms per liter of arsenic. By 1998, it had basically doubled. Alberta Environment has admitted that the concerns in the Cold Lake region are contaminants in the potable water, increasing salinity of surface water, and decreasing water levels. Now, why should the arsenic be high in the Cold Lake region? One group of people got together and they looked at the issue, and they determined that the chemistry of the ground had changed, that you were getting dissolution of the iron oxide, and when iron oxide is reduced, it gives off arsenic. So for some reason, the reduction oxidation potential in the groundwater is changing, and they traced it to the most likely source they thought was soluble organic compounds that might be causing that, but they didn't talk about where those soluble organic compounds are coming from. Another group of people looked at the concentrations of chloride, arsenic, and phenols in a number of study areas in the region, and they documented an increasing concentration in only the northeast Beaver River area, with no trends elsewhere over time. Now, it just so happens that the northeast Beaver River area, they looked at all of these kinds of activities, and they concluded that this area had the highest densities of inactive oil and gas wells, injection and disposal wells. In other words, connect the dots, it's clear that the reason we have increasing concentration of arsenic in only the northeast Beaver River area boils down to the fact that that's where most of the industrial activity is taking place. Water quantity, one major concern is we don't know how much water will be needed for in situ development. It is changing almost weekly as new projects come online and scale up. We know that the Horizon project has a requirement or an allocation that is a permitted amount of basically 80 plus 35, so 115 million cubic meters per year just for one project. Their actual use in the Athabasca River is much lower than that right now, but there are 88 registered in situ projects already in Alberta. We also have declining flows on rivers. For example, if you look at the annual flow of the lower Athabasca and the Beaver River, there are long-term trends of decreasing water volumes per year. Since 1956 on the Beaver River, the mean annual flow has fallen 72%. That's an unimaginable decline in the amount of water flowing down the Beaver River. The primary driver for this is climate change, but water removals on the Beaver River or by Imperial and CNRL may contribute. We just looked at about this focus here. You know, rivers in this part of the world undergo a major decline in flow in the wintertime, and that's when the biota that live in the river are the most stressed, because that's when the least oxygen is in the water. So the Beaver River naturally declines to a trickle, 1.85 meters cubed per second in the middle of the winter, and the companies are removing more than 25% of this flow for their activities. So this is a critical stress to the biota at that time of year. This is what the actual trends in the for the lower Athabasca look like since 1957 and 1954 or so on the Beaver River. That's a long-term regression line there. So again, we're looking at a situation where more and more water is being requested from nature, and nature is unable to maintain even the base flows. Okay, let's look at in situ landscape effects. Up here in A, this is the fragmentation in an area of SAG-D and processing south of Fort McMurray. You can see here, here's the facility, number of wells, and the incredibly high density seismic leading to basically a landscape that is torn to shreds in terms of its landscape structure. Here we look at a highly developed area in the Cold Lake area. That's B here, near the Beaver River. And then we can contrast this reality with the statement again from Minister Renner, who told me in situ production methods have a significantly smaller footprint than open pit methods. They don't. A study was done by Schneider and Dyer 2006 where they calculated what the average effects would be from in situ, and they concluded that it had a very high density of wells and associated infrastructure, that 8% of the land would be basically just completely denuded, and the density of linear disturbances would be 3.2 kilometers per kilometer squared. So keep that number in mind, and we'll see how that compares to what caribou need. A recent study done by wildlife biologists looked at how much woodland caribou can tolerate in terms of landscape fragmentation. And to make a long story short, if there's a linear corridor density of that value, which we just observed would be the typical for a SAG-D, caribou are extirpated. There's not a chance that they can survive. They can survive if it's a fairly modest seismic line density, but they also have to have no human caribou harvest and insignificant black bear predation. So basically, SAG-D spells the end of caribou if it goes ahead as it's going ahead thus far.
What type of caribou are they talking about?
Woodland caribou. Yeah.
When you get to Fort Chip, they have a tendency to think of
right, the barren land coming down the lake, yeah. Okay, sorry this is hard to read, but human health concerns. Elevated levels of mercury and arsenic in the fishes are well documented. We know that arsenic is a carcinogen that's been studied very well. It's linked with increased rates of bile duct cancer, liver cancer, urinary tract and skin cancers, vascular diseases, and type 2 diabetes. We also know that when you expose mammals to arsenic and PAHs at the same time, it's not just an additive effect. They actually make the carcinogenic effect much greater. In this case, 8 to 18 times greater for arsenic and benzoate pyrene. Now, contrary to what the government says, actually the fact is 11 of 13 environmental impact assessments of tar sands projects concluded there were elevated human health risks. That's from SEMA. Now, 2 recent government studies concluded that the incidences of type 2 diabetes, lupus, renal failure, and hypertension were elevated at Fort Chip. Government reports, good data. Another study published just last year, Chen, who is an oncologist, statistical oncologist or cancer doctor, looked at the number of cancer cases overall in Fort Chip, and she concluded that there was a 30% elevated incidence of overall cancers in the community, and of individual types of cancer, bile duct cancers, cancers of the blood and lymphatic system, and leukemia, what are known as soft tissue sarcomas, were all elevated. Now, it's plausible that exposure of arsenic and PAHs and mercury in the country foods that people are using is a factor. It wouldn't explain everything, but could be a factor. Now, again, on this specific issue, Minister Renner told me, quote, recent health assessments conducted by the Government of Alberta and the Alberta Cancer Board found no evidence of increased rates of cancer, no, or other illnesses, no. So again, this is a completely false statement by the minister as of a few weeks ago, in writing, which is nice. Okay, let's look a little bit about particulates. There are chronic exposures and acute exposures. Chronic exposures have been fairly well studied, and we now know that there are increased rates of cardiovascular disease, respiratory symptoms, and lung cancer. A very interesting study was done recently, and they determined that the risk of a cardiac arrest out of the hospital was related to exposure of the person to particulates of 15 micrograms per meter cube in the hour preceding. Now, put this in perspective, the highest PM2.5 concentrations in the entire province were at Suncor Millennium in 2006, 66 micrograms per meter cube as a peak level. These are very high levels of particulates. Now, we know the particulates themselves are damaging just because they're particulates and they tend to decrease your lung function. But they also act as carriers. They will carry other pollutants on the surface of the dust particles, such as PAHs, arsenic, vanadium, and mercury, into the lungs where they can do further damage. So the occupational exposure, in particular for people who work in the industry, is probably significant, and I'm surprised that the union has not made some more noise about that. Now, several studies have just come out in the last few weeks to bring you completely up to date. Aaron Kelly, David Schindler, and a bunch of others came up with a study that I was involved in where we looked at a large number of study sites spread all the way from upstream of Fort McMurray downstream to Fort Chip. So in 2008, within 50 kilometers of the facilities, the snowpack loading of airborne particulates was 11,400 tons over 4 months, which is the equivalent of 600 tons of bitumen landing onto the snow. Now, the PAHs that are in these particulates increased by 2 to 20-fold upstream versus downstream in the tributaries to the Athabasca, and in the main stem, the PAHs increased 1.2 to about 5-fold upstream versus downstream of industrial activity. They also concluded that development within the past 2 years has led to elevated PAHs that are likely toxic to fish embryos. Now, this is a shocker. In the melted snow, the dissolved PAHs were up to 4.8 micrograms per liter, which is 400 times higher than the winter concentration of the PAHs in the tributaries. So these particulates are not harmless dust. Now, this is a lovely slide from their study. These discs here are actually pieces of what was white paper, was filter paper. And so when we gathered the snow, we melted the snow and then put it through filters to filter out the amount of particulates that were in the snow, which were then captured on the filter paper. And what Erin did here was she laid out the discs on a table and then plotted the scale of all the kilometers apart. So this is upstream of Fort McMurray, but fairly close to Fort McMurray. We're going downstream. So here we're right next to Syncrude, Mildred Lake, and Suncor. You can see it's just pitch black here. And as we go farther to the east and farther to the west or farther downstream, the particulate loading of the snow declines accordingly. So that's...
Those numbers, the kilometers out it is from?
Each of these numbers is the kilometers apart. So this sample was 46 kilometers from this one. This one was 10 from that one. This one was 21 from that one. So it's comparing how we're trying to squeeze 221 kilometers of distance onto a table, and so there's a little bit of a distortion between, if we were to put it to scale, it would, not 1-to-1, obviously, but we just had to lay them out on the table such that it fit within a photograph. So the bottom line here is that the particulate loading of the snow is a very important factor that has been ignored for a very long time. Now there's another study that just hasn't even been published yet, but David Schindler sent me the abstract. So instead of looking at PAHs in this study, they're doing the same study site, they're looking at toxic metals. So they looked at 31 different elements that were in the snow, and they noticed that 28 of the elements were elevated near development. In sites where more than 25% of the watershed had been disturbed, in the winter time there was an increase of 7 elements in the winter and 27 elements in the summer, upstream versus downstream. In the winter, and in the main stem, they noticed that 7 elements were elevated in the main stem near the tailings ponds and fountains and facilities. In the summer, the effects are much greater. So in the main stem, 29 of the 31 elements were elevated on the Athabasca main stem, and the 16 of those elements remained elevated above background all the way down into the Athabasca Delta. Concentrations of the 12 of the elements remained above background near Fort Chip. Now, if we look at US EPA's Clean Water Act, the loadings to snow and river water for all 13 of them were elevated by development. They noticed that they concluded that the guidelines for protection of aquatic life were exceeded most frequently near development, and both papers concluded that major improvements were needed both in the management or the reduction of release, but also in the monitoring of the impacts. Another study just looked at, and this was just published a couple of weeks ago in the Journal of Limnology. They looked at 12 lakes, and they actually took sediment cores, so they went back in time to reconstruct the inputs to the lakes, spread across a fairly large region. And they noticed that the sediments contain these sort of round carbon particles that they traced back to combustion products. So all of the lake sediment cores, all 12 lakes, showed that pollutants were landing in the lakes and accumulating in the sediment. They also found that most lakes were being nutrient enriched. In other words, you're getting nitrogen deposition into the lake, changes in the diatoms, kinds of algae that live in the water column. And so they concluded that climate change, forest fires, and human activities were probably explaining that. One of the lakes showed strong evidence of acidification. It was the smallest of the lakes. And they looked at the mercury in that lake, and I'll show you what that looks like. So this is this one lake here, which is just over here, sort of across the river from Syncrude and Suncor. And if you look at the amount of flux, that is the amount of mercury that's entering the sediment, it jumps. And in 1980, when the development really started to take off in the area, if we look at the amount of mercury that's in the sediment, we notice that there's sort of a spike here in the Industrial Revolution when you've got massive inputs of particulates burning from coal, for example, and then you get more increases over time. Again, so fairly unequivocal evidence that you're getting mercury deposition that's directly related to human activity. These are the 12 lakes. Some of these lakes you see no trend because these are lakes like 100 kilometers from the facility. So if you look at the lakes that are fairly near the facilities, you see this is the concentration of these little bits of particulate carbon that are from burning of fossil fuels in the tar sands. Again, they're spiking. All those that are near the activities are showing major increases in the deposition of combustion products. This was an interesting conclusion. These scientists came right out and said there is a lack of regional monitoring programs. I thought this was wonderful because, you know, RAMP, we're all saying RAMP is, you know, a pretty bogus initiative for many reasons. And these people just said, oh, there's no monitoring. There's no scientifically credible monitoring. So what they did was they looked at 32 lakes and they did an assessment of the invertebrates that live in the sediment. They concluded that the kinds of invertebrates that were living in the sediment in the test lakes, that are those in high deposition areas, differed from the reference lakes. When they did standard statistics, they concluded that all 5 lakes were impaired. Their fauna that was living in the sediment were impaired, and that's an important conclusion. They did another kind of analysis where 3 of the lakes were potentially impaired. They concluded. Another study looked at gaseous nitric acid and ammonia spread across a study region over a 4-year period. They concluded that these were elevated and highly variable in space and time. Again, it all makes sense. It's just that here they are now the facts that when people are lying to you, you can say, no, here are the facts. Sorry, this is the way it is. Stop with your nonsense. Ammonia levels were the most concern. They reached a very high level in the air. And they concluded, they also observed in 2008 that the elevated ammonia levels were extending to quite remote locations, well distant from the sources. And they concluded finally that the amount of ammonia was such that it could cause effects on the lichens at some distance from the facilities. Another study looked at airborne nitrogen compounds. Again, they concluded clear evidence of the lichens were being affected by excess of nitrogen, and they found that the sites that are closest to the industrial activity are probably reaching the point where they can no longer absorb any more nitrogen. Finally, a look at sulfur. They're acid-sensitive soils in the region because they're composed mostly of quartz in the uplands, which have a very low weathering rate, so they can't take in a lot of acidic compounds without affecting their pH. So they concluded that depending on how the nitrogen is being dealt with in the soil, that, you know, 1/3 to almost 2/3 of the sites are already receiving deposition in excess of the critical load. So again, the upland soils are in danger. Summary and conclusions. I would have to conclude that we already have an immediate and long-term problem with our water quality and quantity, wildlife, and environmental public health. We also have to ask the question, where is the federal government? The Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and the keepers of the Athabasca petitioned the federal government to take some action, and the federal ministers responded, no evidence of any deposit by a person of a deleterious substance has been found. No evidence has been found that groundwater contamination from the tar sands tailing ponds is leaching into the river. Unbelievable, but this is what they wrote. Environment Canada has found no evidence that the Fisheries Act has been contravening with respect to contamination. Unbelievable, but there you go. Okay, so let's return to the 4 questions. Do present levels of contaminants, regardless of where they're coming from, present a risk? Yes. These include PAHs, mercury, and arsenic in the lower Athabasca River, and a host of air pollutants. Do contaminants increase downstream of industrial activity when you compare them to sites upstream? Yes, again. PAHs in the Muskeg River, poor water metals in the Athabasca, Tenfold increase in hormonal effects on slimy sculpin in the Steepbank River, downstream of development. Examples. The question, is there evidence of increased contaminants over time? Again, yes. PAH is in the sediment, mercury in the fishes, arsenic in the water and sediment, and contaminants such as in the air, such as fine particulates, volatile organic compounds, sulfur dioxide are examples, and increased rates of fish abnormalities observed by fishermen. And the final way of phrasing the question, are there documented incidents of pollution? Yes, there are far too many to list, but some of the major ones were spills 67, 68, 1970, 82, 2007 into the Athabasca main stem. The Alsands ditch was a major environmental impact that has not been very well publicized, but there were large increases of sulfate, cations, and various metals caused by the ditching of the area and drainage by the industry. And of course, another well-documented case is the number of birds that are dying each year in the tailings ponds, and of course, the biota has been obliterated from about 65,000 hectares. So the evidence is fairly clear, I would have to conclude. So let's go to sort of a deeper level now and think, why is this happening? Well, this has been studied by a group of scientists from UBC and several other universities, and they concluded that whenever there's the prospect of wealth, it generates power, political and otherwise, that promotes the exploitation. We have real-world ecosystem-level concerns, but it's very difficult to understand what's happening because you don't have the typical controls that you would have in a laboratory. So it's difficult for people who are concerned to make a case that this is happening when there's so much natural variation. Now, we also have a situation where most of the relevant data have come to be held privately under ramp and industry, and that is an anti-democratic issue entirely. Another interesting thing is that this person has studied how organizations tend to distort information to meet their institutional objectives. Obviously, in the case of the Alberta government, they distort reality simply because there's a tremendous amount of profits involved and a tremendous financial liability. I'm hoping at some point in the future that this comes to bear, because there are real damages happening now to the environment and to people, and unless these people start to pay, they're just going to continue. Modern organizations have two properties when it comes to this problem. They develop a very complex technological system that has a lot of power to change ecosystems, and they also practice widespread self-deception. So when I get letters from Minister Renner, I'm thinking he may even believe these things. He may, because his advisors are, all this information gets filtered as it gets up to the top, and so the person sitting at the top is probably completely out of touch with the reality. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. Okay, let me just skip over that. So when we have a situation where there's widespread self-deception, there's privately held data, there's government and industry that are working together towards something, towards a common goal, and we have really a lack of monitoring, a lack of independent oversight, and lax enforcement, it's the root of catastrophes that have been well documented, and they include the crash of the Space Shuttle Challenger, Chernobyl, the Iraq War, the destruction of the Grand Banks fishery, and the Waterton, Ontario tainted water disaster. These are all situations where information was withheld from people who needed to know, that agencies were not enforcing or fulfilling their fiduciary mandates, and this is what happens. So now we have the scourge of bitumen exploitation. Now this fellow Ransom Myers here is a famous fisheries biologist who died recently of cancer, but he studied this issue also, and he talked about how science can be disregarded and corrupted by bureaucrats who are answering to politicians who are not answering to us. And he demonstrated that in the case of the collapse of the Grand Banks fishery, that data were held secret and the scientists were not allowed to analyze the results, or those who were allowed to analyze their results were either suppressed or they weren't allowed to publish them. So what? Well, it's the end of nature as we know it. I hate to end on a major down note, but I don't know what else to tell you other than the fact that if there are not major changes in how this resource is being exploited, nature will be changed irretrievably, because once these contaminants get into the system, spread over a large area in northeastern Alberta, into Saskatchewan, into Lake Athabasca, the cat's out of the bag, and what do we do about it? I don't know. I leave that up to you, and I think the reason you're here tonight is because you want to do something about it, and you probably have some very good ideas as to ways of changing how things are being done, because I think what we're finding is that the old ways of trying to dialogue with industry and government are not working. So I think the people who are concerned about human health and environmental health and nature need to get creative. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes.
Kevin, it's nice to see a picture of the area where Jay Custer, the young man who was arrested after scaling the House of Commons wall in this last fall and got his nose bled. And he and I were in a canoe, and Peter Cyprian of Fort Chipewyan and another woman from Victoria were in a canoe at that very spot. It's nice to see all the aerial shots.
Mm-hmm.
The river bank just downstream from the edge of the slide there, where trees were just covered with dust from bitumen.
Mm-hmm.
As there were large haulers hauling the bitumen away from the cokers, and the coke dust was just covering the river bank, and of course it covers the ice in the river.
Yes, indeed. That was really one of the most remarkable things I noticed when we were doing the field work in the wintertime, was that layer of particulates on the snow. When we were digging snow pits, you could see strata of when the snow hadn't snowed for a while, and so the particulates would build up, and then we get a fresh layer of snow. So these particulates are accumulating all winter long, being stored, and then when the ice out comes, they're flushed into the system, and then you get a slug of pollutants that has really not been studied. And I think that's one of the things that will be very interesting to look at in the future. What happens to the biota when it's just kind of hanging on, and then ice out comes, and you get this incredible pulse of pollutants into the system. Short-lived, but it may really kick them.
Yeah, Kevin, also on that picture, I'm kind of anticipating that the next sort of misleading information, because as I understand, Suncor has pumped out that Tar Island pond, mm-hmm. and is covering the top. Mm-hmm. I guess they will say, well, what do you mean? That's not a tailings pond anymore. Has there been study about what the long-term seepage will continue to be from that, even though it's not being actively filled anymore?
Yeah, I think there was a thesis done by a lady by the name of Grace Hunter, and she produced a model that looked at where the most of the water was coming from and what were the rates. And I think she looked at how long it will continue. Yeah, even if there's no surface water, there will be seepage for a very long period because all of that, the tailings are saturated. Right? Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Just a quick question. What does PAH mean?
Oh, PAH, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons.
Oh, wow.
They're kind of organic compound that have ring compounds. So, you know, you've got a straight chain of carbon. If you bend it back upon itself, you make a ring. That's called a cycle. And if you have polycyclic, it means there's more than one ring. So these are fairly complex organic chemicals that exist naturally in nature. For example, if you were to have a campfire, there are PAHs in the smoke. It's a different kind of PAH. They're not alkylated forms. But still, they are in nature, they're in forest fires, they're in bitumen, they're in fossil fuels that are burned, etc. And many of them are very bad actors in terms of carcinogenic effects.
You talked about the air pollution and the effects of it. So how far west would it be as a crow flies?
How far west? Well, if you were to look at that, the diagram of the filter papers, it actually went at least 30 kilometers west and probably at least 50 kilometers east because you generally get prevailing from the west. But that's just the particulates. They'll tend to fall out first, whereas things like H2S and sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, they're gases, so they'll go much farther. So they're getting into Saskatchewan, they're getting up north to Fort Chip. In fact, there was an interesting study done that looked at gaseous mercury, and they determined that they could detect when the wind was blowing from the south because the gaseous mercury level in Fort Chip rose. So yeah, these compounds go a very long way. Yes.
My understanding that there's elevated levels of cancer in workers in Fort McMurray and people that live in that general area. Have you seen any studies on that?
I have not. It's kind of a different field of the occupational exposure. That's a very complex thing to sort out because so many people are transient, so they'll come in, they'll work for a few years, they move away, they're smoking, they're drinking, etc. There's all these other risk factors, so it's very difficult to kind of get the smoking done, as it were, but clearly these workers are exposed to really elevated levels of all sorts of things that they shouldn't be breathing.
So, in your research, have you come across methods of harvesting this bitumen that are less damaging and potentially better for development?
Well, they're working on different techniques. For example, for the surface mining, they're trying to come up with ways that they can process the bitumen but not create liquid tailings. That would be a major step forward because the tailings ponds create, you know, centuries-long problems. So that's a hopeful sign. In terms of SAG-D or in situ, you know, there's 3 or 4 different kinds of approaches that are being considered, and you know, they're all going to cause major impacts. The new one that is just on the horizon is a thermal extraction method where they drill basically holes in the ground where they stick heating rods in, and the idea is they're going to cook the ground for a few years and actually do the upgrading of the bitumen underground. The problem with that, well, there are several problems, one of which is the electrical requirements of, you know, just think of how many megawatts would be required to heat a massive metal rod that's, you know, 1,000 feet long for years. This is why I believe they're pointing towards nuclear power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Albert.
Yours? Sorry.
My question is similar to Janice's about public health. Just based on your the information that you discovered and also David Schindler's recent data and findings, what would you say to people who are working in the industry, or to communities like Corporate High who are right there, or to communities like Fort Chip who express many concerns regarding particulate?
Well, I mean, in terms of the people in Fort Chip, you know far better than I know that they know a lot of what's going on. The question is, what do you do with that information to make government and industry change? And you know, that's more your expertise than mine. I really don't know, because you have information, you know it's happening, but then how do you get response? I don't know. I wish I could tell you.
Well, I was just wondering, have we not called for a moratorium, and how successful might that be? I mean, obviously that's like, you know, pretty contrary to such land or, you know, allow whatever, but yeah, like, I mean, I know this whole thing what you said, like, you've got to slow this down somehow, right?
Yeah, and various groups have called for a moratorium, but calling for a moratorium and getting a moratorium are two very different things. So, you know, maybe with the accumulation of more scientific data, there could be an injunction, because that's the only way you can get a stop to something, is to prove harm. If you can, that's a very major legal burden of proof. But it's coming to a point now where harm can be proven. And so if the group went to the right judge and had the right presentation, there might be an injunction. And that would be a moratorium. But I don't think that Mr. Stelmach and Mr. Harper have a moratorium on their agenda.
Well, there was a young doctor, he left that area really quite I caught him, he actually went public.
Dr. O'Connor, you mean?